Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Dialogues and Debates session for opening up for MozFest. And thank you for joining us in your different time zones. My name is Chennai Chair, and I'm the Special Advisor for Africa Innovation Mozilla, joining this call from Johannesburg in South Africa. So it's a pretty late time for me. And I'm pretty excited today because we're going to talk about what it means to have AI reckoning and if AI can ever be the people's tool. So joining me on this panel today is Adam Bly of System, and Zia Singupta, co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge, Sasha Constanza Schock, Director of Research and Design of the Algorithm Justice League, Roxana Stafford, Systems Alchemist and Architect. So I'm very excited to chat today, as you can see from the fantastic panel lineup that we have. One last thing though is we're taking questions for the panel in real time. So tweet them to @Mozilla Festival with the hashtag Dialogues and Debates. If you're watching on the MozFest Plaza or Vimeo, you can use the chat function to add your questions. Right, so we'll kick off with our panel. And this is a question that I'm going to ask everyone, and we can always bounce off everyone and point. But what exactly is systems thinking, which is one of the things that we're using to underlie our approach to rethinking and AI reckoning? I'll open up to any one of the panelists.
I can jump in. There's so many different ways to define systems. I think one of the ways when I think about systems, and in particular, the topic that we have at hand, is when you have a systems mindset, you understand relationships and dependencies. And the relationships and dependencies help you not only understand what you are designing in a sense of world building, but also what are the limits and barriers that are present, right? And those limits and barriers don't necessarily have to be negative. In fact, some of those limits and barriers allow us to be that much more respectful in the honoring of resources, including time, including natural resources as well. So when we talk about coming from a place of systems, we're actually coming from a place of valuing and recognizing the inherent value of all. So that the challenge that's before you really is to think about, how do we amplify and uplift that? And what do we need to do such that the relationships are present for our ever-changing and dynamic worlds in which we live in? So that's one of the ways when I start to think about systems thinking and what is being unfolded to us right now, especially as we reflect on this notion of reimagining and reinventing things, right? That prefix re is all about again and repetition and looking back. But we also have to realize when we're talking about systems thinking, we must not get, how do I want to say this, seduced by the notion of nostalgia, because that is when we start to get into these problems of not understanding that we have the freedom, right, to start to think differently. And that freedom comes from that inherent understanding of relationships and dependencies. But I want to hear what everyone else has to say.
Thanks so much, Roxana. Sorry, I was going to pass it on to you, Sasha.
Thanks. Yeah, I love the way that you just laid it out, Roxanne. I think what I wanted to add to that is that although it's not necessarily part of what's classically considered the domain of systems thinking, when I hear this question, I immediately start thinking about what are systems of power and oppression and resistance that we need to be aware of and attuned to as we think about building socio-technical systems like so-called artificial intelligence. And the way that I think about this is really heavily influenced by scholars like Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote the classic text Black Feminist Thought. She went on to become the president of the American Sociological Association, and she developed this term, the matrix of domination, as a way to talk about the interlocking systems of oppression that structure our lives. And so she was in particular talking about white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. And we could extend that to also be specific about settler colonialism, Islamophobia, ableism. In short, any large structural and historical forces that have impacts on shaping our day-to-day lives based on where we exist as subjects within that larger matrix of domination. So raced, class, gendered, abled subjects. And so as we build socio-technical systems, if we don't pay careful attention, then the default is typically to reinscribe the matrix of domination, to reproduce white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, and settler colonialism through the many small decisions that, say, an automated decision system, might be making. We have to be intentional if we want to shift those harmful systems into more just and sustainable ones.
Thanks, Sasha. So I just want to remark on the points that you've both made, Sasha and Roxana, how it's interesting. Systems thinking gives us a way of actually thinking through the technologies we want to implement, being aware of realities that we exist in, and actually taking on this relational perspective where it's not necessarily just like we've got a technology and then we put it into place without taking into account the existing context. And I'll come on to you, Anasio, in the work that you've done, especially with Whose Knowledge. I think that is an interesting space where it allows for system thinking. And I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Janae. And I love what both Roxanne and Sasha said. And I want to say a couple of things speaking to them and this larger notion of systems thinking. First, let's admit that it's a fancy way of saying how people have often always understood their interconnectedness, right? And so for those of us who are theorists and practitioners or live in practice, which is where I think the integrity of intention and doing, thinking and doing come into agreement with each other. Our lived experiences, our embodied experiences are never single issue. They're never siloed. They're never segmented, right? So all of us at whatever levels of power and privilege we have an understanding of what systems thinking is in the doing and being of ourselves. What is really important, though, is when you take that and look at the foundations of power and privilege, as Sasha said, because without that, what can happen is exactly what Roxanne said, which is you can look at history nostalgically, or you can look at history as a way to recognize why the relationships of power and privilege segment us as they do, and why we have constructed systems of oppression as we have, and what intersectionality means when we are in conversation with each other and in relationship with each other. And so for me, we cannot think about systems without thinking about power and privilege, dispower and disprivilege, and recognizing that power is also dynamic, it's contextual. So just as an example, I am often, this is such a wonderful and unusual panel for me, because I'm often in conversation with folks who don't look like me, who aren't Black or brown or non-binary bodies, speaking to each other about tech in a primarily white, male, straight space, right? And yet, in my embodiment as an upper caste Savarna woman from India, I come with the embodiment of power and a history of oppression of my own families and their extended communities. And so power is dynamic. So systems thinking is also about recognizing that in our interrelationality, in both our relations of power and our relationships of power and intimacy, we are in context with each other. These relationships are always contextual, always specific, always embedded and embodied, including in tech, which we often construct as an extremely disembodied space, especially when we talk about AI. So, I'd love to see where maybe Adam will take it.
I would be happy to sort of build on that. I think that was just I would echo the three previous comments, and honestly, I think the essential point that you've raised around the how native systems thinking is to us, it's not something that we've kind of are coming to. I think it is something Mary Catherine Bateson, the cultural anthropologist, talks about it as something that has always been a part of us, and we've kind of industrialized out of it. We've built societies to move us away from being true systems thinkers. And I think similarly, it's important as we kind of embark on these kinds of conversations, it's useful to remind ourselves that the silos that we live with today, whether that's in society, whether that's in the way we organize our understanding of the climate, whether it's in the way we understand our health, these are all artificial sort of projections of order onto nature at some moment in time for some purpose, whether that was epistemological. We wanted to understand the world a certain way, so we broke it up a certain way. The convenience of simply having a couple of genders. All of these things are simply projections of a societal framework onto nature. And I think we often forget that with that, there's a great deal of kind of debt that comes from the way we organize at any given moment in time. There's going to be something missing, some truth that's missing in the way we organize and silo up about that underlying system. And I think what we're seeing today is that debt is accumulating in society, of people not feeling represented, of countries failing us in the way we need to resolve the biggest global issues, from COVID to climate change. The way we organize our governments and our multilateral institutions no longer reflects the reality of a crisis in Ukraine. These are not just sort of geopolitical, these affect human rights and food security and political instability around the world. So I think it's just always helpful to feel emboldened as architects of new systems of trying to improve the world, to remind ourselves that these were momentary conveniences that result in some residual debt, some harm, some lack of representation that so many feel today. But it's not native to, the planet. It's not native to ourselves. It's really just a momentary projection, and that means we can fix it. We can kind of come together and rethink how we organize ourselves and define ourselves.
Thank you both. And I think just from what you've both said, Anasia and Adam, it's really interesting how there's the context around being embodied, and actually it being embedded in a particular place, and that artificial imposition of categories working for a moment in time. So in this current conversation, right, we're thinking about the reckoning of AI. And I would like for us to interrogate what exactly we mean by a reckoning, and in what context are we making the phrase, as we've actually really emphasized that contextual understanding throughout this conversation. Sasha, you want to go first?
Sure. So yeah, what would it mean for there to be a reckoning for AI? The way that I think about this, from the vantage point where I am now, so I'm working as the Director of Research and Design for the Algorithmic Justice League, which is an organization that was founded by Dr. Joy Buolamwini to try to ensure that we minimize the harms and maximize accountability from artificial intelligence. And that's a broad umbrella term that people are typically using to talk about a set of different technologies like machine learning and computer vision and a number of other things. I think that partly what's happening right now is, as automated decision systems started to get deployed by different actors, including government agencies and companies in more and more domains of life, in everything from content recommendation engines to predictive policing tools, more and more people started to both experience and then talk about publicly the harms that these systems are doing to people. And journalists started to take note and to write about the ways that harmful AI systems had been deployed in different ways. And it started to, so the conversation started to shift a little bit from here's these wonderful new tools that we can deploy and they're like magic and they will make everything more efficient and better for everyone, to, oh my goodness, whoops, there are really harmful things happening and we don't really understand why, and we need to figure that out. And we need to figure out how there can be some accountability and how we can minimize those harms. So for example, a few years ago, ProPublica did a story about the way that a widely used recidivism risk prediction score tool that's used in many courts in the United States, it basically assigns a risk score that someone is going to commit a new crime. And it turned out under independent analysis that this risk prediction was racist. It over-predicted the likelihood of Black people recidivating and under-predicted the likelihood of white people recidivating. So here is an automated decision system that's trained on a number of data sets that's being used to affect something so fundamental as whether someone is going to be placed in a cage or not. And so that was one important warning bell that said, wait a minute, we need to really look more closely at these systems and we need to think about whether they should be deployed at all. And what does it mean for them to be biased and harmful? And so that reckoning, I think, is the growing awareness of the ways that these tools are being deployed in more and more domains of everyday life. And people's increasing interest in organizing and mobilizing to both expose those harms and for there to be some accountability. And we're seeing some of that in everything from municipalities that are passing bills to say, police here can't use facial recognition technology without a lot more oversight, if at all. Or in New York City, passing a bill at the level of the city council saying that, for assigning people to public housing, there has to be independent oversight and analysis of any tools for racial bias. And again, none of these municipal bills are perfect, but I think they're part of a broader wave of people saying, hold up, wait a minute, this is happening without oversight and we need to put on the brakes.
Sasha, I'm so glad you brought up Compass. It's important to historically think about this, even going back to lantern laws, right? That were used to surveil Black folks in this country. Chennai, back to your question about what does reckoning mean? What does this look like? There's a notion of time in that, right? And I think, Adam, you started to point us in that direction because you mentioned that for some people, there are these moments of inconvenience. And for the rest of us, it lasts thousands of years of oppression, right? And so we have to understand time when we're talking about this notion of reckoning. And that's why, Sasha, I love what you said about waves and oceans, right? We actually have to think about this as all of us constantly moving in that direction of making sure that the just-based changes are occurring, right? Oftentimes, again, when we think about reckoning, it is that future date and state where someone will be held accountable, right? There is no someone, there's no future. It is all now happening and will continue to happen, which is why this notion of how an ocean works in that ecosystem is so important for us in terms of accountability. And so I love how you bring up this notion of accountability and making sure that we're examining ourselves in that. And the only way to do that is to have an embodied self in this work, right? So when we talk about this notion of AI, artificial intelligence, this notion of something being artificial, right? There's all these images, I'm sure, that are conjuring up in minds about what that means. And more often than not, those are images that are not embodied in anything, right? They're not they actually don't even have a body. right? Or have an origin or have roots, right? And so again, in this notion of what we want to do with this reckoning, or the whole larger question is there an AI reckoning? I would want folks to think about it from the standpoint of how can you show up as a practice, continuously show up in this type of work? What does that mean? What does that look like for you? How can you embody, right, what these zeros and ones are doing to our brothers and our sisters that are trapped in the carceral system, right? To our neighbors who are trying just to live in a home and raise a family, right? All of these things require us to have an embodied sense of what is going on and not an artificial sense. Because when we lean into the artificial, that allows us to forget who is a human. And that then allows us to say we can do anything we want because some bodies, literally some bodies, are valuable and other bodies are not, right? And so again, the reckoning comes when we start to move into a practice that is about interdependence, a practice that allows us to understand that the zeros and ones are about expansion, about accountability, right? And not about blame. And I hope we have an opportunity to start talking about what it means to call people in and invite them into this practice, invite them to be a wave, as Sasha reminded us earlier, because that's the only way we're going to be able to not only hold folks accountable, but to actually live in that future state that a reckoning is supposed to be about, which I think is a future state where the justice, the feelings of that justice, right, is normal as breathing, is normal as being in water like a fish.
So I love what Roxanne just said, unsurprisingly. And I'm going to sort of hold two things simultaneously, which, you know, one of the things about this work is we construct these binaries because binaries are convenient, but our worlds are not binary. They're on a continuum, they're complex, they're often seem in paradox with each other. So one of the things to hold is that blame is different from responsibility. And one of the things that structural analysis and relational analysis gives us, and I'm going to use that as a way of talking about systems thinking because that's my training and the way I think about practice, is that we do need to hold responsibility. And we do need to have structural analysis. But structural analysis allows us to move away from individual blame to structural transformation through a community of practice or communities of practice, right? And as we do that, I love, Roxanne, how you talked about reckoning as being something that means different things to different people, because people are in different moments of what this reckoning might look like. To use climate justice as an analogy or as a contemporary counterpart to the AI reckoning, when we talk about a 3-degree world, there are countless communities across the world right now, including some of my own, who have been in that space of crisis for decades, right? What is an AI reckoning today is an AI reckoning of those with a certain level of structural power and privilege who are finally feeling the brunt of what that algorithmic oppression means to them. And therefore, we're suddenly having these conversations. But if, for instance, we were asking the surveilled folks in prisons 20 years ago what it felt to be surveilled, we were asking, you know, Dalits 250 years ago when the British Empire did its first census in India, we would recognize that there have been different histories of this reckoning that have, as you said, Roxanne, come upon us in different cyclical ways. And so the question then becomes, what is a reckoning if we don't ask the questions, whose accountability and what forms? Whose reckoning in the sense of whose bodies are most affected, whose bodies, minds, souls are most affected, and then whose imaginations are going to get us out of this. Because I honestly don't believe that the same imaginations that got us here are going to get us out of here. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. What I do think is that we can be in solidarity with each other, but we have to center those who are most affected, and we have to center those whose imaginations have been least understood or heard. You know, Wakanda is not an Afro future. Wakanda is a possible Afro past. If colonialism, capitalism had not occurred as it had, Wakanda could very well have been an Afro past.
I'd love to build on that theme of truth lies with those who are oppressed. I think that's so fundamentally at the core of how we have to kind of reimagine going forward. Those who are suffering from systemic racism in America today, or those who are suffering from this in South America today, who are being forced to leave their crops and immigrate to another country, those who are forced to migrate out of war zones in Ukraine today, or those who are suffering food instability because of geopolitics. These are the people whose lives are being most manifested because of the oppressive nature of the constructs that we've set up in society, again, that have been convenient for a few and oppressive to most. And I think that there's something very meaningful to just bring this into a sort of technological context. The foundation of the scientific method, the foundation of sort of designing things through the empirical process is to observe. It starts with observation. And I think so often those who are in positions of privilege, who are architecting these algorithms, designing these systems, skip that step, frankly, and don't recognize that deep observation, deep empathy, it has to be at the beginnings of designing any hypotheses, any algorithms, any sort of systems that are designed to scale out some particular process or apply some decision-making or some predictive model to society. I think we have allowed ourselves for far too long to skip that empathy, skip that observational step, skip that deep anthropological step. And today, as a result, we see, as Sasha pointed out, a tremendous amount of bias in the sampling of these data sets, as Roxanne emphasized with Compass. We see tremendous bias in, obviously, the composition of the communities designing those algorithms and putting those systems into practice. I think we also see today the absence of a systemic understanding for the context for those things being measured in a population, why things happen, what's 1 degree away from that. So if we're looking at matters of criminal justice, are we looking at drug policy in that same context? Are we looking at education in that same context? Are we looking at the effects on voting rights in that same context? We're not doing that today, and nor are we looking at the full systemic context that these algorithms then land into, that these AIs land into. And so I think the absence of that systemic context at the input and at the output is critical. And I'd say the final sort of point when we're designing algorithms or any of these AIs is to think about what's the objective function? What are we ultimately optimizing for? And I think for so long, we've had this very narrow view of what success looks like for these kinds of systems. And it's not a holistic, it's not a systemic appreciation for the dignity of the self or for the things that if we were to sit down around the table and redefine objective functions for society, we would codify, we would newly codify and then design our AIs for that. These are big, hard questions, and it's hard, obviously, to build alignment around, but I think it's really important as transparency in the algorithms points out, that at least we have to see all the places where bias exists today, conveniences persist, and begin to repair those.
So, I mean, like all of the points that you said are so riveting. And for me, it's really quite interesting in terms of thinking about how it's it's possible, right, for everyone to be part of their conversation from their particular context and being embodied and embedded. So the question that I have is really a two-part question in terms of like, what does the practice look like in terms of like bringing in community in this systems way of thinking, and how do we help people to understand reckoning, especially in context of power dynamics where again certain voices will be prioritized over other voices? So then how does this work in this particular system, knowing the context that we have around power dynamics and exclusion and certain voices being prioritized? Sasha, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a good question. So this question for me calls to mind, the story of Robert Williams, who's a Black man who lives in a suburb of Detroit, who was arrested in front of his wife and 2 young kids after Detroit police mistakenly identified him as someone who had, committed a crime based on a false positive match with the facial recognition system. He only learned about this because once he'd been arrested and booked, he overheard the officers talking about this. And so this is an example of where facial recognition technology, which is known to function least well on people with the darkest skin types, which was empirically demonstrated by Dr. Bulamwini and Dr. Timnit Gebru in the paper called Gender Shades. And then that finding was later verified by a NIST study, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Well, so here's an example where that particular type of failure leads to a wrongful arrest. But when we think about, accountability and who's going to be involved in rethinking the design of these systems and creating accountability, I think we need to bring in what Ruha Benjamin calls the new Jim Code, which is her term for discriminatory design that amplifies racial hierarchies through engineered inequity, default discrimination, coded exposure, and techno-benevolence. And the techno-benevolence part is key because one strand of response to what happened to Robert Williams is well-meaning technologists saying, well, clearly what we need to do is improve the data set so that the facial recognition technology functions better and we won't have as many false, positive matches, and then it'll be less biased, right? But the response to that is to say, well, but even a really, a retooled facial recognition technology deployed by police, but deployed unequally because policing resources are deployed unequally in the United States of America under racial capitalism, is going to continue to reproduce inequality, even if the particular tool functions slightly, quote unquote, better for its intended purpose. And so instead, what we need is responses like the one that was developed in San Diego, where a coalition called Trust SD of community organizations came together, and they initially came together to organize against facial recognition technology and cameras being installed on streetlights in the city of San Diego. But over time, they modified their proposal to the city council, and they said, we don't want to just stop this one technology from being deployed, and we don't just want it to only be deployed if it performs better, right? We want community oversight before any new surveillance technology is purchased and deployed, by the police here. And they actually won that, and they got the city council there to unanimously pass, a local that says the police can't deploy anything without review from any new surveillance, technology without community oversight. And so I think that that's an example of, the type of reckoning that we want to move towards, not only one where there is a techno-benevolent solution imagined where we just make these tools more inclusive. It's contextual, and sometimes we don't want to deploy these systems at all. Sometimes we do want them to be more inclusive, maybe on, a skincare diagnostic tool that was trained on a data set of mostly, white skin and can't perform as well, and, on darker skin tones. Well, there's a case where, maybe we would want it, to work better, maybe not. That could be a longer debate. But whether or not we want to develop and deploy these tools at all, is contextual, and we want community accountability.
Thanks so much, Sasha. And I think that actually like responds to the question of like how do we include people in that and being part of the process and documenting their experiences. Roxanne, I'm going to put you on the spot. And I think in an earlier conversation we had, you spoke about, thinking about the practice also to include pleasure, play, and rest. And I often find sometimes in these conversations, we also don't talk about that aspect of, as people become part of the system and engage with the issues, how then also do we amplify that aspect around like it being also a joyful experience. And I think that's important, especially when we interact with technology.
Yeah, I mean, joy is such a powerful like force, right? When we are joyful, right, it's like we have wings. Our intellect is keener. We're able to understand our sphere of influence that much better, right? Which means we're able to listen and hear others and be able to, look at what is happening in our community and know how to respond. But if you are not an active practice and engagement around joy, this type of work that we're all describing can be extremely tiring, right? Burnout is real, as the kids say, right? But there is a deeper thing that's going on when we're talking about these systems that have been designed to tell you that you are not a human, you have no value, right? So when you hear those types of things, you actually have to rise up a lot more. And that's where, Chinai, to your point about our earlier conversation, where play, joy, the arts, it is not a coincidence, right, that the artists and creatives among us, and that includes folks on this panel, we use that as a way to explore these difficult, right, and deeply horrifying problems, because we know through the avenue of the arts, we can start to, again, step into that new world, right? So to Anasua's point of Wakanda being Afro-past, right? If those colonial forces weren't present, among many other things, right? But there's something about stepping into that world, the imagination of it and the creativity of it that starts to allow you to determine, we don't need to live in the new Jim Code state, right? And again, shout out to all of our dear friend, Dr. Ruha Benjamin, for coining that. We can live in the state where we are able to actually encode joy, right? And the practice of encoding joy means that we have to do the work on ourselves just as much as we do the work for our larger community. That means that we look at the notion of rest in many different ways that we can define it, right? So again, it's not a binary construct of, did you get 8 hours of sleep? That's not what we're talking about, right? Rest can be daydreaming, right? Rest can be meditating, right? Rest can be putting your feet in the sand in the ocean, right? For those of you who are in how a joyful practice of rest can be a part of your larger abolitionist tech movement, you should definitely check out the work of Tricia Hershey and the Nap Ministry. This work is deep work that the scholarship comes from, and again, I'm Indigenous and Black from the US, so it comes from the Black folks of this particular country and understanding our relationship to labor. Tricia Hershey has been able to take that and these notions of joy and rest and allow people to start to think about, how can you show up consistently? How can you show up in a way that allows everyone to breathe? And one of the things I want to share with folks who are tuning in now or even later is that this is not about having degrees. This is not about going to certain universities or schools or having certain things published, although those things are extremely helpful. Like what I want to say back to your other question of how do we get more people involved, right? It is what we talked about at the top of our time together. We are naturally a people, all of us a people that are interconnected. We are naturally a people that think in systems, and we're also naturally a people of joy, right? So all of us, right, can practice and come from a place of pleasure, come from a place of play, and come from a place of joy in order to better know how not only to show up, but how to transform things that are about an invitation instead of calling people out. Because you can invite people in and hold them accountable. And when you invite people in the spirit of joy, they will come alongside you. And we need more people alongside us.
Thanks so much, Roxanne. I think it's what you just said is if you invite people in a spirit of joy, they will come along. It just had me picturing like music playing along and people having discourse. And that was part of the opening circle today. We had a musician, and that kind of like brings people into the spirit. It's a feeling of being part of the system, not necessarily just saying, you know, I'm just part of it and taking on this, like I need a degree to be part of the conversation. And so I to our questions from the audience. And so the first question that we had, which actually still builds up on this conversation of including people, was from Twitter handle Kolio Majama, where she says, there is a growing need to promote algorithmic accountability and reframing AI transparency discourse. How do we ensure that the people matter? So in the cases you said, they've used the term users, are part of the movement with the apparent power disparities that exist, especially in design. So I'm going to ask Anasuya if you would like to engage with this.
Sure. It's, you know, coming back to practice, I'm going to use, and just to say, I'm still sitting with what Roxanne said and wanting to add that joy is resistance, right? That joy is a core element of resistance. And one of the ways that I think about joy and the practice of joy is through language. I mean, especially all of us who are artists, I think about that. And one of the key elements around language that is key to this conversation around AI and algorithmic oppression, you know, shout out to Timnit and Margaret Mitchell and others who were, you know, where firing from a certain company is a badge of honor, and we'll take it as that. One of the key ways of thinking about joy is the ability to be ourselves through our own languages, right? And one of the key ways in which we are not ourselves on the internet right now is through language. So again, just pulling all of these bits together, AI is no one thing, right? It's a constellation of technologies that does many different things and is contextual. The key, as with all things tech, is not about asking necessarily what the methodology is, but what is the intention and how do we get there? So in terms of the question of how do we make sure that those affected are centered in the imagination and design, I'm going to use an example of language. And Alex Hanna and others have talked about this, but what happens when we think about algorithmic and automated systems being based on small data sets rather than large data sets? What happens when we start thinking about the sovereignty of data, right? Rather than the proprietary nature of the large language model that we already have such well-researched criticism into. There's an extraordinary effort in Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Papareo, which is a Maori led radio station where they have pulled together their own database of Maori, of Aotearoa Maori, the language. And that data set and the voice technology that they've created is very much governed by them, used by them. And what's really interesting is, of course, they have a critique of proprietary tech, but they also have a critique of FLOSS, of free and open source tech. Because one of their critiques is that FLOSS, as well as free and open source tech as well, has still been privileged in terms of who can access and who has been able to use FLOSS systems and tech as a techie. And that actually is true, as many of us who are FLOSS evangelists know. So one of the things, and I'm going to say this about practice, is that we, as we've been thinking about language and multilinguality and multimodality as a key way to counter algorithmic oppression in terms of knowledge and content, knowledge content on the internet. Because yes, you know, you could say improve the data set, but whose data set? and who governs these data sets, right? So we've been looking at multivocality, and Chenai, this is very much to your work as well at Common Voice, but our State of the Internet's Languages report, which dropped just last week, so I'm just going to give it a shout out and say we're going to have a conversation about it later on in MOSFest on Thursday. But we look at the embodied versions of different forms of language, recognize that of the over 7,000 languages in the world, half of them are oral. Therefore, even our data sets don't in any way represent them. Only 500 of the over 7,000 are represented in any form of content on the internet. The internet itself, in terms of the data set of knowledge and information, is primarily monolingual, which means it's also monocultural. We're still talking in English. English is not my first language. It's not the first language of most of the people in the world, right? And so as we do our work, one of the ways in which we practice shifting the center of gravity and the center of power around knowledge production, data set governance, and therefore algorithms of justice are to start with people's embodied needs. So we start, for instance, with a multilingual, multimodal conversation. We've invested over the last couple of years. This is the only reason I'll use Zoom, because Zoom actually gives you an interpretation feature. We've invested so much in having multilingual simultaneous interpretation so that people can join these really complex conversations in their own languages. Our launch party for the languages report last week was simultaneously in English, in Arabic, in Bangla, in Portuguese, and in Spanish. And it was the first time for many of our communities that they could show up and talk about algorithmic oppressions of different kinds and their embodied and disembodied experiences digitally online in their own languages. That was joy. That was joy in a way I have rarely seen and felt and expressed. So again, what happens when we shift all of these, this mythos that we have been given, right? Of the large data set, of the large model, of the proprietary big tech that is going to vacuum up all of us and construct algorithmic justice of some kind that is not designed by those who most matter. What happens when we start with small? What happens when we start with sovereign? What happens when we look at connectivity? And what happens most of all when we start with what does an internet of joy look like?
I kind of feel like that should be a completely different panel where we talk about what does an internet of joy look like, because that imagination actually has me very excited to be like, if we're thinking about a reckoning, let's think about it from a place of joy and actually includes everybody into the conversation. So there's the second question that, thank you so much, Anasia, for responding to that question. And I know there's going to be a response where we share Sasha's book as well on the tweets that has been put forward, but I know we're running out of time. So I'd like to get all of the participants to also, or the panelists to also respond to some of the other questions. So we have another question from Joseph Wilson, CA. And the question they raise is there a danger when interpreting power through a lens of systems thinking that responsibility for acting against oppressive policies or algorithms becomes diffused through the network and no one is held responsible? Adam, do you want to take this one?
Really interesting question. I think there's a kind of sequencing consideration implied in that question, perhaps. I think if we were to see a diffusion of accountability, of responsibility across all of the various facets or elements in a system, as opposed to a central actor who's responsible, while the current regime of models and algorithms are at play, I think that's a very fair risk that we'd be inappropriately sequencing kind of one thing ahead of the other, and it would probably reduce accountability among our current, at the same time we're seeing a decline in kind of the effectiveness of liberal democracies around the world. So there's a sort of side question there, but nonetheless, I think it would create a situation that we would want to avoid. So I think it is, in all of these questions, I think what we're talking about is a new lens on governance, as much as a new lens on decision making, as much as a new lens on participation in the deliberative process. These are all things that need to be reframed through systems right now. And so a better model of governance, if you were to take up the thought experiment of how would you redesign governance through the lens of systems, so that once you put these improved technological systems into play, they would have the absorptive capacity in society to actually to manifest systemically. Then we would certainly, we would be less concerned about, there needing to be a single point of failure or single concentration of power. We would want a more collaborative model where those responsible for concerning themselves with one facet of climate, for example, were more aware of how decisions they made in one part of a system impacted all the things around it. That would be a much more rational and responsive way of ultimately guiding decision making in a more systemic context. I think ultimately, to bring it back to the question, we need to be rethinking the governance through the lens of systems while we're considering how we improve these actual AIs that are making the predictions or making the decisions or adjudicating certain cases in society. So that's how I would think about it. I think you're right to point out the sort of sequencing gap if one precedes the other.
Thank you so much, Adam. So we're actually, time always flies when you're having fun. So I guess that's the internet of joy, if we could just slow down the time. I would like for our amazing panelists to actually give us some closing remarks, and also if they could respond to a particular question that was raised by Dr. Tix. And the question was, if there were to be a global general strike, no work day, day of rest, sleep in day on 1st of October 2022, what would you want to be the demands? So on your day of rest, what are we pushing for? And do feel free to respond to this in your closing remarks or any other points that you'd want us to raise and reflect on as we work towards the end of the session. I will start with Sasha.
Sure. So in my closing remarks, I guess I'll just add a little bit more to the response to question 2 first, which is about diffusing accountability and what, where does responsibility lie? And I think that responsibility lies with all of us, no matter where we are or who we are or what role we play or what type of privilege we may have. And I'm really, really inspired by all of the people at different positions who are taking action to create more accountable AI. And I'm thinking of the high school students from Encode Justice who are fighting against an organization based in the US that's fighting against the imposition of AI surveillance systems in their high schools, or groups like Fight for the Future that are working to help hold different companies like Spotify or ID.me accountable for the harmful use of algorithmic systems. I'm thinking of the ways that people are introducing bills at the municipal level, the state level, like California has, a bill that requires auditing of automated decision-making systems. But there's even a federal bill in the US now, which is the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022 that's been reintroduced by Senator Wyden's office. And then there's all the people inside companies that are taking action, whether they're quitting or whistleblowing or walking out tracks that their company has with ICE and harmful immigration. So I'll take action. And for the last question, My one demand would be nothing about us without us, which is the slogan from the disability rights and disability justice movement.
Thanks, Sasha. Roxanne?
Well, there's so many things going through my head in terms of closing. I guess one thing that I was like thinking about in all of this is, you know, oftentimes when folks who haven't had a chance to participate in abolitionist-based movements define abolition as stopping and not doing something anymore. And what they need to realize is that abolition is about creation. It is about world building. It is about recognizing and embracing other ways of being that are predicated on our shared humanity. And so, you know, my hope would be as folks continue to learn more about this, because there's always more to learn, right? No matter where you are in your process, that you are open to this notion of whatever you're creating, whatever part of the process that you show up in, is that you are reinforcing this notion of a shared humanity. And in terms of this last question and demands, you know, the first thing that actually came to my mind is like ease. I would love for us, again, thinking about this from a standpoint of what is a practice. And again, when Anna, when you and I talk about practice, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but we're talking about it from a movement-based way of thinking, not I'm practicing this to get better, but a way of evolving and being a human. So if we are going to have a day, right, where no work or no rest, my hope would be that it is a day of practice and ease. And so we actually flip this notion of what does the demand mean and what does the demand look like, right? Which is what I think you're saying too, Sasha, about, you know, if in order for this to be effective, we all need to be able to participate, right? And in order to be able to participate and sustain this type of practice, we actually have to be in a state of ease. And that is something that many people have never experienced, but could be one of those hallmarks of an internet of joy.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Adam?
I'm very inspired by the movement that took place in the 60s to galvanize around our sense of fragility as a planet, and that against the backdrop of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring led to Stuart Brand and others distributing pins around the United States saying, "Why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet?" As a response, as a sort of design intervention to create the overview effect that he and others felt we lacked, to point us to a shared sense of the fragility and limited nature of resources on the planet. And 2 years after that, we got Earthrise and developed a shared image of our planet. And that subsequently led to the birth of modern environmentalism. And I think today, on that sort of day of rest, that sort of recalls Niepi, I feel like the question is why haven't we seen it all connected yet? I think the demand now is a new kind of overview effect that actually finally shows us what Ada Lovelace says, that everything is naturally related and connected. Let us see that. Let us finally see how everything is indeed related and connected. And we have the capacity now to do that. And I think that would be galvanizing and transformative to the world.
Thank you, Adam. Anastasia, your closing remark?
Gosh, so many things that come from all three of my fabulous co-panelists and some of your work, Chennai. Couple of things I'm left with. One is that without romanticizing and essentializing Indigenous nations, there are over 6,000 of them across the world, so there is no essentializing possible, though we still do it sometimes. There is a way in which we can learn the interconnectedness that has been at the heart of our cosmologies and their epistemologies, including the fact that everything is sentient for them other than the creations of human imagination. So they remind us that humans are the youngest species in the world. Every other life on this planet is older than us. But the one thing that doesn't have sentience is what we create. And so let's once again try not to use AI as a frame, because just that notion of intelligence then, as others have said before me, pushes away the accountability from us. And we have all to be responsible, as Sasha said. The second thing, and this is my request to all of you who are friends and co-conspirators, is as we think about systems of algorithmic oppression and systems of algorithmic justice, and potentially, oh my goodness, the algorithms of joy through public good and the centering of our imaginations, let's not fall into the trap that Silicon Valley often forces us into ourselves, which is that the United States is not the global. So even as we talk about this work, I ask us all to think very seriously about the ways and the examples, the contexts, and the ways in which algorithmic injustice and justice are working elsewhere in the world. And all of my fabulous folks who are working against these systems of oppression. And so for that day of rest, perhaps I could say that perhaps it's a question. What would a day of ease look like for those who most look differently to us, who feel the most distant from us? What would a day of ease look like for them? And how do we hold them in our thoughts and in our practice as individuals and as movements of justice?
Yeah, finger snaps all around for this amazing panel. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who was at home was watching. To our panelists, this was a really great interventions for all of us to learn from. So tune in tomorrow, 11:30 a.m. ET or 5:30 p.m. CET for a conversation around about building ancestral AI. Keep an eye on our social media at Mozilla Festival on Twitter, where we announce future dialogues and debate panels and really other exciting and great things happening at MozFest this week. I really want to say a special thanks to the MozFest and Mozilla Foundation team, Zaina, Abiasi, Kevin, Marcos, Marissa, Andy, Khan, Alex, and our fantastic panelists for actually making this a reality tonight. My time. Take care, everyone, and we'll catch up soon. And do enjoy the rest of your MozFest experience.
that launching